All right, time now to bring in our political panel, and joining us today, both from Melbourne, we have Labor MP Michelle Ananda-Rajah, the member for Higgins, and from the almost neighbouring seat of Menzies, Liberal MP Keith Wolahan. Welcome to both. Let's try and cover a bit of ground today. Michelle, to you first. Just keen to explore your thinking about this CFMEU proposal for a super profits tax to fund, well, roughly speaking, 1 million homes in this country. Does it hold any attraction to you as a caucus member?
Hi, Greg. Look, we are all for social and affordable housing, but not if it compromises Aussie jobs and business confidence. So I think, we have a absolutely massive housing agenda. And as you know, we've delivered $9.5 billion towards social and affordable housing in this financial year, the one that's just passed actually alone. And that includes $2 billion for our social housing accelerator, and that money's already going out the door to build those homes. We've got a build-to-rent sector that we have supercharged with tax incentives that will add 150,000 to 250,000 properties, according to the Property Council. We've got this National Housing Accord, which aims to build 1 million homes in the next 5 years from 2024. And right now we have a bill in the Senate called the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is currently stalled because it's been blocked by the Liberals and the Greens, who want some sort of policy nirvana. Now, this bill is aimed to create 30,000 homes in the next 5 years and into perpetuity. So that bill, could be delivered if the Greens and the Liberals decide to actually get it through the upper house.
Well, somehow I think we'll be talking much more about that when you all return, senators included, to Canberra next week. But to you, Keith, I'm not entirely sure about the motivation of the CFMEU in contributing this proposal, but I'm fairly certain it wouldn't find much favour from the Liberal side of the chamber.
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon, Michelle. I'll give the CFMEU credit for addressing one of the most important issues in Australia, and that gets to the heart of how this government has managed to unite the Greens and the Liberal Party, because it's a bad bill. It's a bad bill that at its best seeks to produce 30,000 new homes, but that's the aspiration. It doesn't work. So we're not going to support a bad bill, and we need to do better. But there's two elephants in the room when it comes to housing. One is our proposal to really have super for housing really injected into the decision-making cycle of young people, because young people, we trust them to make the decision with their money, and that is a policy that will lead to more housing in this sector. But there's another one, which is population policy. Over the next 5 years, we're going to see 1.5 million more migrants. Now, I'm a migrant, Michelle is a migrant, and most of our seats are full of migrants. But we need to make sure that the number matches what we can do in response for housing, transport, wages and green spaces. And
right, so are you for a slowdown on that? Are you for a slowdown on that then, Keith? Is that what you're saying?
I think we need to do the work. We need to analyse it to make sure that state and federal governments can respond proportionately. We have a housing crisis. We do. We can all agree on that. But we're not going to solve that by turning our heads away from the increased population growth that we will have. We have to make sure that it's managed in a way that makes places like Melbourne a livable city into the future.
Yeah, we've certainly got a bit of a gap reconciling the demands and the supply at the moment. Let's move on to industrial relations. Michelle, I might go to you first. This agenda outlined last night by Tony Burke to give casuals, and give more casuals really, the chance to convert to permanent conditions. Why wouldn't that be a red flag to employers? They clearly seem concerned, and perhaps legitimately, that it is not entirely cost neutral in what they have to wear if that conversion is made. Is that legitimate?
Well, look, Greg, I think just to take a big picture view of this, I think for too long in this country, we have treated workers as if they are a problem. They've been managed as if they are a problem, when instead they are actually a social and economic asset, not only to businesses, who are crying out for them, by the way, but also to our country. So the changes that are being proposed now relate to casual workers, who amount around 2.1 million in Australia, And we think that only around 850,000 of that cohort will be eligible for this. Now, what we're trying to do actually is close the loopholes around casualised work, which, by the way, involves something like 50% women, and a heck of a lot of young people, up to 40% are actually young people, and these are our children and our grandchildren. So we're trying to tighten up these loopholes in order to give people who are on casual work a pathway to permanency and try and dial down that precarity that these workers suffer from, which we know entrenches inequality and can lead to all kinds of problems in our community at large.
You call it a loophole, Michelle, but what do you understand the proportion within the 850,000 to be, the proportion who would want to convert or feel that somehow they're trapped in a loophole?
We think that number is very small. I've heard estimates of around 1 to 2% actually. Why? Because it's completely voluntary and it really applies to a small group of people who are essentially holding up the sky when it comes to their household budgets. And those people rightfully are seeking financial security. Why? Why does it matter? Because without financial security, you can't get a bank loan for either a house or a business or for those important skills you need in order to climb that ladder of opportunity that we think is available to all Australians, but actually isn't.
All right, Keith, what have employers got to fear, to use that phrase again, cost neutral? If it was cost neutral to convert someone over who had been effectively employed as permanent anyway, but with the casual loadings, what makes employers worse off under this proposal?
Well, as a talking point, that sounds reasonable, but we need to see the detail of the bill. The devil is always in the detail. And what this seeks to do, going off the talking points from the Minister, is to reverse the definition that was introduced in 2021. There was an IR omnibus bill, and most of it didn't get through, but this part did. And it sought to provide a pathway for casuals who had been in employment for more than 12 months. Well, what I'm worried about here is the level of uncertainty that this will inject into the labour market. One thing we know is that in return for flexibility and a 25% loading, you do lose conditions, and no one denies that. But that's by choice mostly, and there's two parties to this. So we want to make sure that there's certainty in the labour market and there's choice for both parties, because a lot of people want to have casual employment and the loading that comes with it.
All right, why don't we move over to The Voice, because I think we try to cover this as frequently as we get both of you on the program. Michelle, to you first of all, as you look at the direction of the polls, and I think there are a couple of mutterings at the fringes of the debate about pushing out the timeline for this. Perhaps, still holding the referendum this year, but going to the back end of the window, more like December, to actually have the vote. Are you seeing any advantages in that? Does the Yes campaign, from your point of view, need extra time to engage those who seem decidedly to not want to take an interest so far?
Well, Greg, we don't actually know when the referendum is going to be called. There's some speculation that it might be October. But look, my read of the situation is that there is a complete mismatch between the polls and what I'm hearing on the ground. Now, I regularly door knock my electorate, and I have traditionally conservative voters who are saying to me, Michelle, we are going to vote yes. And you know why? They're voting yes because they want to close the gap. This is at the heart of the yes argument. Now, I think, the issue around symbolism and recognising 65,000 years of culture, of course, that's important. Of course, that should be put into the birth certificate of our country. But let's not kid ourselves. Symbolism alone is not going to close the gap. It's akin to the acknowledgement to country that we present at every meeting. It's a respectful gesture, but it is not going to close the gap. In order to close the gap, we need a mechanism, and that mechanism is the voice. The X factor to all of this is the lived experience of our First Nations people, and that is what has been missing in policy for the last several decades. Sure. And it's resulted in Indigenous Australians now falling behind. What has actually happened to them is both socially, morally and economically untenable. And we need to, pull the emergency lever here, break glass, and actually do what they want us to do, and they're asking, which is enunciated in the Uluru Statement of the Heart.
All right.
So the voice to me is squarely about closing the gap.
Full speed ahead, says Michelle. Keith, you can comment if you choose on the timing question, but I was actually also keen to draw you out on the comments of Gary Johns. You'd be well aware of them by now. As a no campaigner, do you distance yourself from those? Do you find them uncomfortable or worse, unwanted additions to this debate?
In this debate, all of us are responsible for our own words and what we would use, and I wouldn't use terms like that. But getting back to the timing of this,
Sure.
the timing of this will be what it is. And the important thing, I think, to reflect on is that Australians are cautious about amending our constitution. They always have been. And I think there was a sense of hubris and arrogance in the government earlier in the year when constitutional risk was presented to them and there were options to fix it. And I think going off the polls at the time, the government was quite happy to accept the polls then, but suddenly there's a problem with the polls now. And I think they'll be regretting that arrogance that they showed earlier in the year. That this is not a modest proposal. It has real power, particularly in part 2. And Julian Leeser, who's, I won't pretend he's in the no camp, he's in the yes camp,
Yep.
but he presented options to address that risk. And again, even Julian wasn't listened to at that time. And I'm worried that we'll get to the end of the year, and I think people who are passionate advocates for yes, and I respect them in their position, I think they will regret that they didn't look at that earlier in the year.
All right, well, let's not call it now, because I do believe this year and this debate will be taken in regular increments, which means we'll get a readout from both of you again as this proceeds. We did cover the ground, almost all of it that we wanted to today. Keith, Michelle, thanks again, both of you, for joining us on the program.
Thank
We'll
you.
do it again soon.
Thank you.